Today, we're confronting the Chinese government's systematic persecution and detention of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim populations in Xinjiang, a province in western China. While the Uyghur community, a Muslim minority group of approximately 12 million people, has been targeted by the Chinese government for years, we've seen in recent times a deeply unsettling increase in this behavior and in their efforts to erase the community's ethnic and religious identity. The Chinese government is using sophisticated social and technological surveillance systems in order to control everyday aspects of Uyghur life, crack down on expressions of identity, and detain well over 1 million people. To put that in context, that means at least 1 out of every 12 Uyghurs in Xinjiang has been detained. Men, women, the elderly, and the young. Newly leaked Chinese government documents suggest that ordinary acts such as praying or traveling out of the country could be enough to result in someone being put in detention. We may not know the exact details of what is happening in each detention center, but the first-hand reports from detention are terrifying. Former detainees talk of political indoctrination, torture, forced labor, and even deaths in custody. Perpetrators usually find some rationale for their crimes. In this case, the Chinese government claims to be fighting terrorism or eradicating poverty, but these goals cannot possibly be reached by the systematic persecution of the Uyghur population. Our panelists here today have worked tirelessly to get information from Xinjiang, and they have shared how the Chinese government is undertaking a criminal campaign of persecution. China's systematic campaign against the Uyghur population is characterized by mass detention, forced labor, and discriminatory laws, and supported through high-tech manners of surveillance. There are reasonable grounds to believe that China is responsible for committing crimes against humanity. It is important to recall that crimes against humanity were born out of the experience of the Holocaust and were first prosecuted at Nuremberg. Every government has committed to protect their populations from crimes against humanity. In this case, there's a reasonable basis to believe that the Chinese government is failing in this regard, and they are committing the crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty. Our museum stands as a reminder that how we confront atrocities can send a message to persecuted groups around the world, as well as to potential perpetrators.
Join me in giving a round of applause to the Uyghur activists. They are heroes. Thank you. They are paying the price by speaking out, and thankfully they're not being silent. It's silence that kills more people than anything else. We need to speak out, and we need to speak the truth. The release of leaked PRC government documents further confirms the human rights crisis in Xinjiang. The most recent alleged leaked records reportedly document how the PRC government monitors and targets Uyghur Muslims in Karakax County for peaceful acts that include simply praying, wearing religious attire, or even just applying for a passport. This report is consistent with an overwhelming and growing body of information that exposes the Chinese Communist Party's campaign of repression in Xinjiang and its long-standing war on faith. Contrary to Beijing's narrative, those detained in internment camps are being held against their will, oftentimes for simply exercising their rights to freedom of religion. As we lead the charge against calling on the PRC government to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained and to end its draconian policies that for more than 2 years have terrorized its own citizens in Xinjiang, we must also remember the victims and survivors of this brutal campaign. There is a growing number of brave activists who have publicly shared their stories of repression. This includes Saragul Sayetbey, who this week was honored with the 2020 International Women of Courage Award. She's ethnic Kazakh, born in Xinjiang, and trained as a doctor and educator. In 2017, Chinese authorities forced her to teach Chinese to individuals detained in the internment camps in Xinjiang. She fled to Kazakhstan, where she began to speak out about the PRC government's repressive campaign. We honor her and the countless others, several of whom I have mentioned are here tonight, for their tireless efforts to reveal the truth about the PRC government's actions in Xinjiang. As we all know, religious freedom violations are hardly the only human rights abuses that the Chinese government is perpetrating in Xinjiang and elsewhere. But when a country doesn't respect the right to freely practice one's faith and beliefs, we often see other rights threatened and abused as well. These include the freedom of association, of assembly, of speech, and of press, and of others. The repression must stop. The Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, must release all individuals arbitrarily detained, whether in internment camps or some other form of detention, such as forced labor camps. And those responsible for these abuses must be held to account.
There can be no doubt what the Chinese government is trying to do: stamp out the Uyghur identity. We know forced labor exists both within and outside the mass internment camps, as confirmed by the testimony of former camp detainees, satellite imagery, and official leaked documents from the Chinese government. We know that many U.S. and international companies are complicit in the exploitation of forced labor involving Uyghur and other Muslim minorities. At this point, we need to stop and ask ourselves, what more do we need to know to grasp the seriousness of the situation? What more proof do we need that the most basic human rights of the Uyghurs are being violated? The policies of the Chinese government contravene the letter and spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and violate the government's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but not ratified, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ratified by China in 2001. For all these reasons and more, the Congressional Executive Commission on China recently published a report making the case that the Crimes Against Humanity framework, as defined in Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, may describe the situation of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups in China. The awareness and action of everyone in this room, as well as the moral authority of the Holocaust Museum, is absolutely essential in assessing whether crimes against humanity or worse are being committed. Congress has been active in supporting the Uyghur people. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act passed in both the House and the Senate last year. We expect to send this bill to the President as soon as the differences between the two chambers are worked out. A bipartisan, bicameral group of lawmakers have called on the administration to swiftly impose global Magnitsky Act sanctions on officials in the Chinese government who are complicit in or directing ongoing human rights abuses. We have also called for an expansion of the Commerce Department's entity list, which imposes restrictions on certain businesses and entities that provide technology, training, or equipment that has been used in mass detentions or surveillance. And today, I'm pleased to announce that Senator Marco Rubio and I will introduce the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, new legislation that will prohibit imports from Xinjiang to the United States.
I am a survivor of the Holocaust and a volunteer at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Sadly, the Holocaust did not spell an end to prejudice and hate or to mass atrocities and genocide. I deeply appreciate the work of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide to call attention to new threats to the lives of minority populations like the ones faced by Uyghurs in China, and to remind the world of the solemn pledge made after the Holocaust, never again. I was born in Nazi-occupied Netherlands, and I'm only able to stand before you today because a Dutch-Indonesian family and their Indonesian Muslim nanny risked their lives to rescue a 9-month-old Jewish baby. Tole Madna, the 3 Madna children and their nanny, Mima Saina, cared for me and protected me from the Nazis for 3 long years. They shared their meager food allowance with me because I did not legally exist and was not entitled to ration coupons. They made sure that I did not ever come near a window for fear that passers-by might see a very different-looking child. I slept in Mima's bed, and she kept a knife under her pillow, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me. But what I remember most is being surrounded by love and laughter. My sisters Eva and Leah did not share my good fortune. They had been entrusted to a different family, but were betrayed and denounced to the Nazis and killed in Auschwitz. They were 7 and 5, 2 of 1.5 million children killed during the Holocaust. People asked Tole Madna why he risked the lives of his family to take in a Jewish baby. His response was a simple, "What else was I to do?"
And I wanted to start, Alim, with a question for you, just to help the audience understand a little bit more about who the Uyghur people are and what has been the history of your experience in China. We noted that in recent years, the situation has been deteriorating, and be grateful if you could just explain a little bit about your community and its experiences.
The Uyghur people are one of the oldest Turkic peoples who have lived for at least 2,000 years in Central Asia. Uyghurs established cities-states, kingdoms, even empires in their more than 2,000 years of existence. Uyghur people believed in different religions, such as shamanism, Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, Buddhism, and around the 10th, 11th century, Uyghur people accept Islam as the Arabs conquered Central Asia because of that influence. And Uyghurs have its own very unique language, culture, and religious beliefs unique to its own. China used different approaches, carrot and stick, soft and hard, hard line, soft line, whatnot, up until 2016. Then the Chinese government moved Chen Quanguo, who was a party secretary of Tibet, who pacified Tibet, basically. He was moved to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as a party secretary of the region, who initiated this whole internment camp strategy, locked up anywhere from 1 to 3 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, these indigenous populations, and then start this whole, what many Uyghurs call as cultural genocide or ethnic cleansing, this kind of policy. So the situation turned to extreme after Chen Quanguo became the party secretary in August 2016.
Thank you so much, Alim, for that incredibly succinct kind of overview. Jessica, Alim talked about how since 2016 there's been a rapid increase in the level of surveillance and detention, and that's something that you've been working on. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on what the Chinese government is monitoring and why, and what are some of the techniques that are being used?
Thank you again for having me here tonight. We've heard already some of the techniques. I'll start with those. Those are what get reported on a lot because they're very sexy, right? Facial recognition, people being tracked either through their phones, right? You have a tracking device you carry with you all the time. Trackers being put on people's cards. Sometimes there's even QR codes that the police will scan on people's doors so that they can get information about them before they even walk inside. But we should all be really cognizant of the fact that there's also a lot of old-fashioned, analog human surveillance happening all of the time. And that's not just police patrols or people going to check on your house. These are top-down, very organized efforts to send cadres to live in people's homes, to visit villages, to report on what's happening there. There are efforts to have family members speak out and denounce each other, which is incredibly painful. So the tech aspect is really interesting and gets a lot of reporting and is disturbing in its own way, but we should also remember that there are these very old-fashioned human surveillance techniques which are also very damaging to people. In terms of what they are monitoring, we've also heard a little bit about that tonight. Some of it is religious and cultural behavior, so if people are praying or fasting during Ramadan or wearing certain clothing, that might be something that is monitored. But there's also, again, a lot of things that don't really have anything to do with any of those things. There's a really great list that Human Rights Watch helped put together that was published by Foreign Policy a year or two ago that I recommend people look at. It includes things like owning a tent. These are the sorts of things that can get people, flagged as suspicious and potentially detained. And in terms of why, I think in many ways there's really no satisfying answer to that question at the deepest level. Why does anybody do something like this? But fundamentally, it is trying to identify markers of Uyghurness, because those in some way, the Chinese Communist Party feels that those are in some way an existential threat to itself and to its ability to function as the sole force of authority in its citizens' lives.
So mass extreme control of a population, and as you've said, with an intent to actually just eliminate expressions of cultural identity. One of the ways that they've been doing that is through actual detention. And the Chinese government has stated that they have established re-education camps, vocational training centers. Adrian, you're one of the few people that has actually accessed documents, been able to look at some of the thinking behind the Chinese government's policies. Can you comment a little bit on the detention centers, what you understand the conditions to be, why you believe that they've been established, and what you've been able to derive from those papers?
Yes, so the internment campaign of detaining large numbers of Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities into camps is really what distinguishes what's going on in Xinjiang from what China has done in other minority regions, including Tibet and other Tibetan regions. It also distinguishes it from the Cultural Revolution because it's the probably largest targeted internment of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust, basically. And so the internment campaign has established an estimated 1,000 to 1,200 internment camps all over the area. They are of different types, and we have witness accounts that describe different conditions. I would classify them as either psychological torture or physical torture. The first are camps where people describe of being interned and being forced to undergo re-education sessions, which is hour-long sessions of memorizing, reciting, and learning about communist propaganda, which oftentimes they don't intellectually grasp at all, but they're having to repeat it, of Chinese language. And what they also very much get told is that the law is above religion in the sense of they are forced to give up their religion. They're forced to renounce religious belief. Now, those in the camps who describe more of the psychological torture, what they are really describing is the uncertainty of being interned and not knowing when you're released because they have not committed any crime. It has an incredible psychological impact to be put into a camp with barbed wire where you can't get out, and you know you're there because you are a Uyghur or Kazakh. You don't know how long you're going to be there. But beyond that, we have reports of rape, of torture, and of inappropriately high mortality rates due to camp conditions. There are different types of facilities. Re-education, what it does, it doesn't kill the body, although people can die from higher mortality and the conditions, and guards do lose nerves and people do get killed. But it doesn't kill so much the body as it kills the soul. And the conditions in there are designed to break people down and they can be released as those who are thoroughly intimidated. There's no privacy at all. There's cameras everywhere. The daily routines are highly regulated, and we have some unprecedented insight into the management of these camps through the China cables, the incredible leak of a confidential classified document that came out end of November last year, indicating no privacy, prison-like conditions. So this is really how the internment works.
Roshan, we very much appreciate you being here and willing to talk about your own family's experience. Your sister, from what I understand, has been in prison for the last year and a half. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you know of her experience and how it has impacted you and your family.
Thank you so much. Being here today, it's really emotional and personal to me, because when I go through the museum, when I see the people, the Jewish people, I can see the Uyghurs there, and the Nazi Germany, I can see the Chinese Communist government. The millions of people there, we are talking about 1 to 3 million. They are all normal, ordinary people like everybody. If I ask my fellow Uyghurs sitting here in this room today if they have anybody in the camps who will stand up, I'm sure every one of them will stand up, because everybody is missing dozens of relatives or friends or families. So I started to talk about the atrocity, and I was on a panel like this at one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., on September 6, 2018, talking about the conditions of the camps and also the faith of my in-laws, the entire family of my husband, my mother and the father-in-laws, my sister-in-laws and their husbands, 14 of his nieces and nephews. They were all missing since April 2017. 6 days after I spoke on a panel, as an American citizen, under my constitutional rights, exercising my freedom of speech and freedom of expression, my sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, retired medical doctor, she was abducted. It has been 19 months now. I have absolutely no information on her whereabouts. Unfortunately, she's just one of the millions that's going through slavery, modern-day slavery. They are working on production. And also, the millions of people there, they are the elites of the Uyghur community. They're professors, university presidents, and doctors, actors, actresses. There are over 500,000 Uyghur kids are sent to government-run orphanages. Just imagine what kind of trauma it's going to live on those children when they are growing up with indoctrination, and they forsake their ethnic identity, and they're being educated in the communist ideologies. And when we are reading 1.1 million Han Chinese cadres deployed to Uyghur homes to live with them, live in their homes, and supervising their daily lives, and even sleeping with the women in the same bed, Uyghur women, it's unimaginable what kind of feeling, the impact it leaves on us, on the Uyghur communities.
When the whole internment camp started, the Chinese government basically just like switched off the whole telecommunication for the Uyghurs in exile. So just one day, nobody can communicate with their loved ones anymore. So nobody knows what happened to their parents, to their brothers, sisters, and other loved ones, even their children. And it became, the entire region became an information black hole. And people panicked, people tried different ways, different apps, and it was impossible. Then people realized something was wrong. Then at Radio Free Asia, we first began to report in fact, the mass, in a way, return of Uyghur students studying in Egypt. Suddenly, we learned, a number of, there were anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 Uyghurs studying in Egypt. And then a lot of them began to return. Other Uyghurs began to panic. When we did the interviews with the students there, they're basically saying, we got a call from our parents, or either they were kind of held hostage by the Chinese authorities, so they told us to return. So they say, we love our parents, so what choice do we have? So a lot of them returned. Once they returned, they disappeared for good. We were able to confirm some of them being detained upon return, some of them being even basically dead in the camps upon their return. Then we were able to speak to Chinese officials, some Uyghur officials, Chinese police, Uyghur police, and the local residents, for example, in Kashgar, in Hotan, other areas, regarding the sudden large-scale detention of the Uyghurs. People are disappearing. Then this kind of makeshift camps being built. Then when we are able to talk to different areas, especially, for example, in 2017, we were able to speak to Chinese officials and confirm that in Kashgar prefecture alone, 120,000 Uyghur, mostly males, have been arbitrarily detained in the camps. We need to understand these people have not committed any crimes. These are all arbitrary detentions. The reason of their detentions, in addition to what Adrian earlier explained, is because this is to prevent some sort of crime. These people seem to have the tendency to commit crime. It's kind of like the movie Minority Report. Before somebody thinks about committing some kind of crime, that person needs to be nabbed. So this is the reason of their detentions. But later, as 2017, it was kind of okay for us to confirm a lot of these cases, but the Chinese government, because they use this high tech, they use facial and voice recognition, all of this technology, they were trying to do their best to prevent any kind of leakage of information. When the international community started to pay attention, especially became an issue in 2018 at the UN level, 2019, it became such a big issue. So we don't have reporters or stringers in China anywhere. Our primary method of finding out what's happening is through calling. Calling is extremely difficult for us now. Our reporters work very hard just to confirm a tip, to confirm something we have heard, to basically verify at the end of the day to confirm that's a fact. It takes days, even sometimes weeks. But I think so far we're punching above our weight, basically doing a job to let the international community know exactly what's happening to the Uyghurs in these detentions.
It's truly remarkable. Jessica.
Yeah, I would say because of all the things that Alim just mentioned, people have had to get really creative, both from the outside looking in and from people on the inside trying to get information out. So I already mentioned satellite imagery being a really good thing for a lot of researchers, not just to look at the camps, but, well, looking at the camps, then also recently they did to try to determine which ones are open or not. Things like how much light is coming on at night, like really creative things that you might do in places like North Korea. But people there too have found really creative ways to try to get the word out. As Alim mentioned, WeChat's been weaponized. It no longer, even if you can contact your family members, you can't say anything because it's used as a monitoring tool. But people are finding ways, such as there's these heart-rending videos that were put up on the Chinese version of TikTok, where they were silent videos and they were just Uyghurs beating their heart along to music. And they didn't say what they were doing, but it was very clear why they were doing it. Those get shut down once the government finds them, but people keep trying to find ways. And again, to go back to this earlier point where the digital is where our focus is, but people are now having to go back to these really analog ways of trying to get information out of this closed society. There's reports of, people sewing letters into their coats and wearing their coats abroad and then giving the letters to people. So that's where people are being pushed backwards to because surveillance is so intense.
We've had 3 sets of leaked documents. The first leak was the Xinjiang papers published by the New York Times. And there, the person who leaked the speeches of Xi Jinping and other documents obviously must have been a somewhat higher up official in a hierarchy. Might even have been a Han Chinese, but could have been a Uyghur, we don't know. Apparently wanted the truth to get out and the Chinese government in Beijing to be held responsible. That was the motivation for the leak, as published by the New York Times. The China cables and the Karakash list documents were leaked by the same source. And again, it was somebody who essentially was willing to risk their lives, even though we don't know anything about their identity, except they came from Xinjiang. And there must be a cry of what is bottled up and, as Alim said, locked in through a digital iron curtain. A cry, these people want the world to know what's going on. And they're willing to risk so much for that. And I don't know what it does. I mean, BBC, CNN, others, they translate these reports into Chinese. And then I think they do get filtered back through various ways and being copied, even if CNN should be blocked. And what a lifeline there must be, that they can somehow, in some way, despite these unbelievable restrictions, unprecedented digital police state restrictions, they can somehow get a word out.
It is truly remarkable, and it also just has echoes to the past, too, if you go through our museum and all of the different efforts and creative efforts that were undertaken by both Jews and non-Jews trying to get information out and literally using the words of screaming to the world to try to have their voices heard.
The leaked documents is the confirmation and the hard evidence for everything we have been saying for the last few years, and all the hard work that scholars like Adrian and Jessica, they did, and also everything the journalists has been reporting. So now we have hard evidence on our hands, and we are talking about what's happening to our relatives and our people in East Turkestan, but still we are not being very successful in getting our family members released. The leader for the Uyghurs in diaspora, the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Mr. Dolkun Isa, his mother was detained and died in the concentration camps, and he found out from Radio Free Asia reports. And recently, the Chinese propaganda media, the Global Times, attacked myself for spreading the rumors, and my organization, and also Mr. Dolkun Isa. While they were releasing those propaganda videos, he found out that his father, who's over 80 years old, he passed away. And what a way to find out your loved ones. But there are so many people here, sitting here, and all the Uyghurs in diaspora. They have no idea their detained family members are still alive, knowing the terrible conditions of the camps, and people are not getting enough nutrition, and now the novel coronavirus being threat, and people are facing starvation, the regular people in East Turkestan facing starvation. So what's happening to the millions of people in the concentration camps? So basically, the option given for Uyghur people today by the Chinese totalitarian communist regime is either you give up your identity, you live like a Han Chinese, or you die in the camps as Uyghurs while we are making you work on forced labor. It's very frustrating as a family member of somebody who's in the camp for the past 19 months.
China is now unhinderingly moving into the long-term plan that they had from the beginning, I believe, and it's shifting away from the camps. So while we had a lot of people in camps and camps being built and camps growing, that's an easy thing to be outraged about. That's an easy thing to actually bring to United Nations and other places, in people locked up in internment camps. China, now we are late in the game, and China is moving away from that. China is now releasing people by determination. Many people are being released, and the Karakash list leaked document also proves a large share of release of people into what? into the unfreedom of a sophisticated police state, largely involving forced labor.
The Chinese government already started to demonizing Uyghur people with false narratives and the disinformation, making the Chinese general public believe that the Uyghurs are backwarded, they are violent, they are uneducated, uncivilized people. Therefore, because of the information blockade, and also the Chinese government is only basically on the Chinese media, what the people see is what the Chinese government wants them to see. So the general public don't really know what is happening to Uyghur people because social media are not free there, and they cannot have the free internet access. Therefore, and also because of the nationalism and the Chinese government's the racially targeted systematic persecution against the Uyghurs being labeled as Islamic, fighting against Islamic extremism. So the general public mostly believe in that. With the current policies, basically Chinese government is killing 4 birds with 1 stone.
This crisis is not going to be solved by politicians and businesses and companies being driven by leaked documents. This can only be driven by humans who care about the fate of their fellow humans.
Our commitment as an institution is to not be silent. We all benefit from the existence of the Uyghur community, from the rich culture, the history, and we will continue to stand in solidarity with your community. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for taking the time to join us tonight. I'd like to thank Alim and Rashan for speaking as well on behalf of your communities and in your own personal capacities, the Holocaust survivors who are in the room, the Uyghur community that is here. I'd also very much like to thank the Holocaust Museum staff. This has been a whole of institution effort, and I truly commend our entire team for the work that we've been doing and that we will continue to do on behalf of the Uyghurs. And as I said, we endeavor to not be silent in the face of the commission of these large-scale crimes against humanity. Thank you for joining us this evening.